Hello everyone, so today we're going to be looking at obedience and this is the dispositional explanations. So as always I'll be following along with the AQA Psychology textbook for Year 1 and AS with the green haired girl on. So things you need to know and be able to recognise, I've included the specification point here which states dispositional explanation for obedience, the authoritarian personality. So we need to know what is meant by a dispositional explanation, and we also need to know that this is an explanation for obedience. When we talk about explanations for obedience, it refers to the authoritarian personality, agentic state, and legitimacy of authority, because all these three are explanations of obedience. If you get a question that tells you to outline an explanation for obedience, it will refer to this spread as well as your social psychological one as well. So what is a dispositional explanation? By this we mean an explanation that looks at a person's personality. It's an explanation such as this is often contrasted with situational explanations. So what we mean by that is a dispositional explanation looks at someone's personality, whereas a situational explanation looks to find something else to be the result of the behaviour, such as a prison results in a certain type of behaviour, whereas a dispositional explanation relates to a person's personality. So as a dispositional explanation, we'll talk about the authoritarian personality. So this authoritarian personality was put forward by Adorno and colleagues because they wanted to understand the anti-Semitism of the Holocaust. And what we mean by anti-Semitism is hatred or discrimination of Jews. So they drew different conclusions to Milgram. So instead they believed high levels of obedience was due to a psychological disorder. So they tried to locate the causes of it in the personality of the individual. So their procedure was this: they used 2,000 middle-class white Americans and their unconscious attitudes towards other racial groups. And what they did was develop something called an F scale. This is a fascism scale, and it's still used even to this day to measure for authoritarian personality. And on that F scale, you had a 1 to 6 scale, and you would circle where you are on the scale, with 6 being extremely like it and 1 being not like it at all. So two examples of what we're on there or are on there is obedience and respect for authority are the most important virtues children should learn. And there is hardly anything lower than a person who does not feel a great love, gratitude and respect for his parents. So it's good to try and remember a couple of examples if you can, in case this comes up as a question whereby you need to do a lot of description. It'll pad your answers out and enable more marks. The findings were that people with authoritarian leanings, they're people who scored highly on the S scale, identified with strong people. They showed excessive respect to those of higher status. They found authoritarian people had a cognitive style. They had no fuzziness between categories of people. So they weren't like unsure about anything. They had very clear categories and they didn't have any fuzziness in their thinking. There was none of these grey areas idea in the sense that, oh well, I'll think about what that means, I'll question it. They just don't question things. And what was found is a positive correlation between authoritarianism and prejudice. So characteristics of this are that those with an authoritarian personality, they have a tendency to be especially obedient to people who have authority. So those that are higher than them, they are extremely respectful of them. But they show a great hatred towards those of inferior status. And what they do is they view society as going to the dogs, and in order for that to not happen, what we need is strong and powerful leaders. And we need to keep traditional views, so we need to have a love of country, religion and family. They're very inflexible in their outlook and they have no grey areas. They don't question anything because they just know. So they don't like this uncertainty feeling. So everything is either right or wrong and there is no in-between areas. So the origin of the authoritarian personality. So what Adorno and colleagues suggest is that this forms in childhood and it's as a result of harsh parenting. So it's a parenting style that is characteristic of strict discipline, absolute loyalty and impossible high standards. And it's characterized by something called conditional love. So that's where the parents will say, oh, I only love you if you blah blah blah, not I love you no matter what. So that's what conditional love is. And according to Adorno, what this does is that it causes hostility in the child, and so they cannot express fear against their parents or go off on one because it's just not acceptable to the parents. So what they do instead is displace this onto someone who they see as weaker. And it's this idea of scapegoating. So they see the weakest child in the classroom and just have a go at them and make them upset because they can't take it out on anybody in their house. And that's the idea of scapegoating. And it explains the trait of respect for higher authority. So they dislike those who are inferior, and this is a psychodynamic explanation. So now we have our evaluation, so our AO3 marks. Now the first strength we've got is research support. So Milgren and Elms in 1966 conducted interviews with fully obedient participants who had scored really high on the F scale. So they believed that there was this link between obedience and authoritarian personality. But do remember that this is just a link, so it's just a correlation. We can't say the authoritarian personality causes obedience, and it's impossible to draw the conclusion that one causes the other. So what we can say is, well, maybe there's a third factor involved. So maybe it's like lower levels of education. So we do have research support because there's a link, but it's not that we can say that it's a definite cause, because something else might be involved as well, influencing the reason why that was found. We have a limitation here, so we have a limited explanation. A single explanation, authoritarian personality, will have difficulty explaining obedient behaviour in a population. In pre-war Germany, what we saw was millions showing that anti-Semitic behaviour that we mentioned. But really, their personalities must have differed in so many different ways. It would be unrealistic to say all those millions of Germans had an authoritarian personality, because they just wouldn't. It's so unlikely for that to have happened. So we need to look at an alternative explanation. And that's why we bring in the theory of social identity theory. And this is where we can say that Germans identified with the anti-Semitic Nazi state. It's the idea that we take on some sort of identity that's around us. A limitation of authoritarian personality is that it is politically biased, in the sense that the F scale measures a tendency towards right-wing ideology. Now, Christo and Jehudi in 1954 argue that this is politically biased because it's ignoring the left wing. And what we find is that actually extreme right and left have much in common, and they both emphasize this complete obedience. So really, it's not a comprehensive explanation, as it doesn't account for obedience to authority across the whole political spectrum. We've also got methodological problems. So there is a flawed methodology with this, and Greenstein in 1969 says this: it's a comedy of methodological errors. So when we look at the F scale, if you have a proper look at it, you can Google that and find questions on it. All the items on there are worded in the same direction. So in theory, if I was to just get it and I put 6, 6, 6 all the way down my page by circling the same answers, ticking them, it would be very likely that I would actually get a high score of authoritarianism by ticking the same line. And that's not very good, because there's this thing called acquiescence bias, and that's whereby you respond to a questionnaire in a way that agrees regardless of the content. So you're not really sure, you just go, oh yeah, that, 6, yeah, 6. And that's not very realistic, therefore. So there was a methodological problem, in the sense that you could get a high score just by ticking the same boxes all the time. And so Adorno also then interviewed participants about childhood experiences. But when he did this, he'd already conducted the F scale on people, so he knew exactly which participants had scored high on the F scale and which had scored low. So therefore he could have used something called leading questions and led people towards saying what he was hoping for. And that's something that does come up in memory, and we'll have a greater look at that in later videos. Further limitation is correlation, not causation. So what they found was that authoritarianism was strongly correlated with measures of prejudice against minority groups. But that doesn't mean that one variable causes the other variable. And Adorno therefore cannot claim that harsh parenting caused the development of authoritarian personality. We can't say that. So it has to be just a correlation. We can't go any further than that. Exam questions. Remember, if you are asked about explanations for obedience, this can be used unless the question says not. So if it comes up with explanations of obedience, you might just think of agentic state and legitimacy of authority, which is fine. But you can use this. So I've just had a look through the question papers available to you, and what I found is this A-Level Paper 1 from June 2017. And what it says is discuss the authoritarian personality as an explanation for obedience, 8 marks. Now discuss means describe and evaluate. Some students get tricked by that. And as this is an A-Level paper, the marks are split differently to what it would be if it was an AS paper. Here we find that AO1 is worth 3 marks and AO3 is worth 5 marks. So here are your levels, the different ones. I always look at the difference between level 3 and 4. So what is it that's different there? We have specialist terminology is used effectively in level 4, and we have specialist terminology is used appropriately in level 3. So there are these minor differences, but you want to be checking what sort of things you want to include in order to get into that top band if that's what you're aiming for. So we have, even in that top band, we have minor detail, expansion of argument is sometimes lacking, whereas in the other one we have it lacking focus. You want to make sure that your answer is focused all the time. That will then enable you to get into those higher bands. Here's your possible content. So as you can see, there's far more points it gives for AO3 as opposed to AO1, because you should ensure that when you're writing that you give more time towards your AO3 points, like that there's more content on AO3. It's not an equal split for A level. So really do have a look at these and see what it's saying. So here we are. Dispositional explanations cannot explain obedience in entire societies. Research findings in obedience studies, Milgram, can be more readily explained by situational factors. You really do be thinking about different evaluation points, because that's not exactly as the book was saying. I think the mark schemes give you extras almost, and see if you can then find your own evidence, what other ones, but it always says credit other relevant information, so don't think that you've just got to stick to what the mark scheme says. Also, look at what else is added on. Answers that just describe the authoritarian personality with no reference to obedience can receive a maximum of 3 marks. So even if you write loads and loads, you're limited to 3 out of the 8 if you don't make any reference to obedience. I think that's the interesting thing about psychology mark schemes, is that it gives those little pointers, and if you're not aware of them, you're going to make those mistakes. I've also found this question. So this is your A-Level Paper 1, Specimen second set. So this is a bit of an example of where all 3 different explanations for obedience can be used here, but it only wants 2 of them. So it might just be that you stick to agentic state and legitimacy of authority, but you can use one of those and dispositional, as in you've got your authoritarian personality that you can use. Look, outline, this is going to be all AO1 marks. There we are, there's your different levels and also your possible explanations. There we are, authoritarian personality, legitimacy of authority, agentic state. Do not be mentioning 3, it says 2. You'll waste time if you try and explain them all, and you won't be getting extra because it's limited to 6. Here we are also, briefly evaluate one of the explanations that you have outlined in your answer to question 1. This is another interesting thing about psychology papers, is that the next question after a previous one can link to it. So if you've just gone for, in your first question, agentic state and authoritarian personality, and then you have to evaluate one of them, and you think, oh gosh, I can't think of any evaluation for that one, don't pick it. Or you can't think for either of them, pick one that you're going to have it for. It's worth actually flicking through your exam paper to check. Like sometimes the exams can trick you by you turning over, so the questions are on separate pages, so you don't notice it, and then you have to go and scrub it all out because you think, I can't answer that one. Make sure you're checking so that if there's a follow-on question, you can answer it. So here's the mark scheme for it. 3 marks a brief evaluation of one of the explanations presented in number question 1. Full marks may be awarded for a single point fully elaborated or for a number of points briefly stated. Content will depend on the explanation chosen. So there we are, that's all AO3 marks, and so 3 marks for that question, and you've got to make sure that it is one that you have outlined in question 1. Okay, thank you for listening and keep practicing.